Does the Bible sometimes seem like Greek to you? Well, you're not alone. Hi, I'm David Servant, and this is HeavenWord TV. Well, thank you so much for joining me once again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Today, we're back in that wonderful epistle of James, what we tend to believe is the earliest epistle that was penned of any of the epistles in the New Testament. So that's why we're in it first of all among all the epistles. We're doing this chronologically, and we're now starting today the 4th chapter of James. But let me set the stage a little bit here. In chapter 3, you'll recall that James had a lot to say about the misuse of the tongue. And clearly, we get the idea from his words in chapter 3 and earlier on about the tongue, because he said, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and doesn't bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. That was like in the first couple of verses of the epistle. We get the idea that there were some problems within the churches that James was writing to, the 12 tribes, the Jewish believers who had been scattered abroad because of the persecution of the church in Jerusalem. And so now it's going to become even more clear that there's problems in those churches. I also mention in chapter 3, James talked about jealousy and selfish ambition. And that theme is going to surface again here now in chapter 4. So let me say right from the beginning here that if there's one thing that this shows us, it shows us that churches have problems. Hey, surprise, surprise. And why do churches have problems? Because churches are made up of people. And people are imperfect. You say, well, I thought people who are born again, act differently. Well, they do act differently. There's no doubt that the work of the Holy Spirit within every born again person, changes them on the inside. However, we learn from reading, various texts in the New Testament that Christians, although they're changed and transformed on the inside, there's still this residue of their old self, the former self, a self that hasn't really been changed. And so within every true believer, there is a war. Paul talked about the war between the spirit and the flesh and so forth. So it's good to stay, balanced on this. And James is going to give us some balance on what can happen when people let the flesh begin to dominate. Okay, so are you ready? James chapter 4 and verse number 1. He asks this question: what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Well, quarrels and conflicts, in the church, that involves people's mouths and tongues, right? Okay, so you can see how this, although it's a new chapter in James, really, of course, James didn't write it in chapter and verse, and this is the continuation of the themes that have already surfaced in the first 3 chapters. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? So there were quarrels and conflicts amongst James's contemporary readership. Here's his answer: is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? Okay, well, let's pause here for a few minutes and talk about this. The New American Standard Bible, from which I'm reading and quoting here, is one of those translations that the translators did their best to be stringently accurate to the Greek, a word-for-word translation. And that is good in many cases because, you're reading exactly the words, the best word-for-word translation that modern Greek scholarship can come up with, at least the guys that did the New American Standard Bible. And these people are smart and they are scholars. However, let's say that someone learns the English language in a foreign country where English is not spoken. Then they come to America and they begin to, hear an American, or let's just say they come to Great Britain or Australia or New Zealand, any place where English is the predominant language, and hear us speak English. Just because they learned English in their country and got the basic vocabulary of it doesn't mean they're going to understand everything we have to say, because there's shades of meanings, there's alternate meanings, there's expressions, there's idioms that we use that, are going to be off their radar completely. And that's the danger you run when you get these, strict word for word interpretations. And here's one of them. If I asked anybody, what's the source of the quarrels and conflicts among you? Chances are you would say, well, it's obvious. It's the source is my pleasures that wage war in my members. That's not what you'd say. You'd probably say, well, because I want my way and they want their way and we both want different ways, and so we get into an argument over it, okay? We're basically selfish in this regard. And so that's, I think, is what's happening here. Accurate translation, but it causes us to scratch our heads. And so here's what I do when I run into these head-scratching verses like this one, the second part of James chapter 4 and verse number 1. I just say, wait a second now, don't get all wrapped up in this, David. You don't have to dive into the Greek then, because if you dive into the Greek, you're going to get something very similar to what they've got, for example, in the New American Standard or the King James, which was a word-for-word translation using English that was used 400 years ago, or the New King James, for that matter, which is a word-for-word translation, that is based on more contemporary English. You have to go into paraphrases, like the New International version certainly tends toward paraphrase. It's not word for word, it's more thought for thought. And those things can be helpful. And, the real stringent Greek guys say, those are inferior translations because there's a lot of leeway for the translators to kind of come up with their own theology and stick it in there and so forth. But thank God we have so many translations. Now, I just want to caution you, though, from being one of those guys who gets out as a Vine's dictionary or something, a Greek dictionary, and begins to try to find nuances and shades of meaning in the Greek that can help, alter what's written there, and then you come up with your own translation using, the alternate meanings of Greek words. Do you understand? That's what the scholars who put together all of our translations have tried to do already. So when you're reading the English, you're reading people who have dug into the Greek and do it basically for a living. Okay, so be very cautious. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next time because it's, I think, worth talking about. Okay? I'll be right back. Well, James asks in James 4:1, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? I was talking last time about how, that does cause us to wonder, what in the world do you mean by that? And I was cautioning, and I want to finish what I was saying there, cautioning you about pulling out your Greek dictionary and trying to find out a better translation, because that's what the guys did who wrote, for example, what I'm reading from the New American Standard and every other translation for that matter. And so you don't really have to, as a layperson like myself or like yourself, dig into the Greek for yourself, because you've got the experts who've done that. A better course of action, perhaps, would be to look at alternate English translations, because those guys are going to come up with all the possibilities of what they think would be the best translation. And you've got strict translations, the word-for-word ones, and you've got the less strict ones in the sense of a word-for-word translation, but are thought-for-thought translations, or more of a paraphrase. I don't limit myself away from any of those things, okay? Because all of those people are doing something to try to figure out the actual best rendition of what was written in Greek. Then secondly, a little piece of advice I want to give you is to use your brain. The Lord thy God hath given thee a brain. That's got to be found somewhere in Scripture. And what is the source of quarrels and conflicts? Well, do you think that the source of quarrels and conflicts amongst those people that James was writing to is any different than the source of quarrels and conflicts amongst any of us today? No, it's going to be the same. And so, some of the paraphrases, some of the thought-for-thought translations don't translate it, is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members, but they'll say something like, is not the fact that you want your way and we're all selfish. I'm just coming up with the paraphrase myself. And you go, well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can relate to that. But this kind of stuff, the source your pleasures that wage war in your members, that, I don't relate to that so much. So just, be at peace and don't worry about it so much, and realize that, they had a way of speaking back then that James's readers would have understood. And when you give it the strict word-for-word translation, boy, it seems like you lose something in that translation for modern folks who are reading it, the strict translation in English. And of course, it does remind me there of another part of Scripture that is a little more clear, where Paul talked about how, every Christian has this war between the spirit and the flesh, that you may not do the things that you do. And he lists the works of the flesh, and he lists the fruit of the Spirit, and obviously these are diametrically opposed to one another. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so forth. Well, the work of the flesh is all selfishness and impatience and, self-centered stuff, just the exact opposite of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit. Okay, so every Christian knows that conflict. And how do you gain the victory? Well, you've got to get up every day and say, Lord, I gladly take up my cross once again today. As you said, I must do that daily, and I deny myself daily. So I recognize the war, and I make a determination at the beginning of each day, I'm going to make sure that the flesh loses the war and the Spirit wins the war, because I devote myself to God. It comes down to what you really determine in your heart. Doesn't mean you don't stumble, doesn't mean you don't need to correct yourself and ask forgiveness at times, okay? So I'm going to paraphrase James 4:1 and the second sentence there, just to say, look, the source of your quarrels is you just want your own way. You have wrong desires within you, and you're letting those wrong desires get the upper hand. Hey, got it? Can you relate to that? Of course you can relate to that. We can all relate to that. And that's the answer. And that's really, no doubt, what James is saying. And so verse number 2, you lust and do not have, and so you commit murder. Well, just to back up what I just said, you lust and do not have, so you commit murder. That's all fits in. You got a wrong desire. You lust, that's a desire, and you commit murder, so you do something that's wrong and selfish. Now, again, strict translation here by the New American Standard. I wish, if I was translating it, I wouldn't have translated you lust. I would have translated either you desire or you really want something and that you don't have, okay? Because lust, to most of us, has a sexual connotation, but it's really not in the original Greek word. And I don't know why, the New American Standard guys had to choose that word. But you desire something that you don't have. So there it is. It's envy once again. It's jealousy. There's something I want. And so what do? I commit murder. Now that's a stickler right there. There's no doubt that that's exactly what James said. He used the word murder there. That's the best translation of the Greek word. But did he really mean that people within the churches, because they weren't getting what they want, were, coveting what other people had, they were murdering those people? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that maybe not. Just because it's so hard to accept that, this is what the people in the church are doing, that they're literally murdering other people because they want what those people have and they're getting it. That would be murder and then theft combined. John tells us in his epistle that no murder has eternal life. Right. Revelation, the lake of fire, that's for the murderers and then the liars and the thieves and so forth. So, I'm just having a hard time believing that James is saying that they literally commit murder. And here's my theory as to what he's really alluding to. I mentioned to you before how many times in the book of James, there's clear allusions to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We just read one a few verses ago. James talked about the peacemakers. Well, that's right out of the Beatitudes. Okay, just a few verses earlier. Well, if you read the Sermon on the Mount after the Beatitudes, one of the things that Jesus says is, you heard it said, you shall not commit murder. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Everyone who says to his brother, you are good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and so forth. And so Jesus seemed to be raising the Pharisaical bar above just a prohibition against physical murder to also include murdering people with your words, which reveals the same problem in the heart as the physical murder. Okay? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about my theory the next time. I'll be right back. Okay, last time we were talking about a little theory of mine that James doesn't literally mean that some of his readers were literally murdering people whom they were jealous of and were trying to get something from those people, and the only way they could get it from them was by murdering them, but that James was alluding to something that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. And again, it bears repetition. There's a lot of clear and maybe implied allusion to the Sermon on the Mount within the Epistle of James. And of course, the early church was doing what Jesus said. He said, go make disciples, teach them to obey all that I've commanded you. And so how can you do that without making reference to the Sermon on the Mount? Okay, so one of the things that Jesus addressed in the Sermon on the Mount was the words that come out of our mouths, which is a main theme in James 3 and now in James 4. And verbally abusing people. And he ties it in with the commandment that forbids murder, one of the 10 commandments. Jesus says, now I'm reading to you from Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 21. You have heard that the ancients were told you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. So if you get nothing else from that, you get the impression that, wow, God is not just opposed to physical murder, he's opposed to murdering people with our words and, saying derogatory things about them that are meant to hurt and cut them, just the same motivation that the murder has, but maybe to a lesser degree that it's carried forth. That being said, again, this is just my theory. You can take it or leave it. And if you don't agree with me, don't bother writing to me and so forth, because I'm sure there's people that disagree with me, and I hope you still love me. I still love you too, okay? But when James says, you lust and do not have, so you commit murder, I'm just suggesting that perhaps his readers knew that he was alluding to what Jesus said about words being potentially murderous and so forth. And again, it does fit the context. The very next verse, you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. Well, that's after he mentions the murder thing. You think to be in the reverse order, progressing from, not as bad to much worse. Fighting and quarreling is not as bad as literally murdering somebody, okay? But Jesus equated fighting and quarreling with murder in a sense, right? Right, nobody can argue with that. Okay, so, this was a problem in the church. It's still a problem in the church today. It's a problem between lots of people in the church. It's a problem between leaders in the church. Leaders in the church fight about all kinds of things. One of the things they fight about is doctrine, and we need to determine what's important and what's not important. And a lot of things that are fought over, and then words are spoken, murderous words that are spoken to those who don't agree with my doctrine or your doctrine, those things are not important enough to verbally murder our brothers and sisters over, okay? James has already said, how can you bless God and then curse someone who's created in his image? There's a contradiction, he mentioned that in chapter 3, okay? Okay, so this is pretty heavy-duty stuff. And then he goes on in verse number 2, you do not have because you do not ask. Wow, that's interesting. He's saying, okay, you've got this envy. Other people have something you want, and so you're fighting, somehow with them in order to get it. And you could get it, however, by another means. You could actually ask God for it. Okay? I think that's the clear implication here. You do not have because you don't ask. He's not talking about asking from the people that you're quarreling with. He's talking about asking from God. Hey, Lord, they're your children. You're blessing them. Instead of me getting jealous and envious of them, why don't I go to the source, the one who gave it to them? Right? Right. But then James adds a little caveat here in verse number 3. You ask, I guess you could say, paraphrase, sometimes you actually do ask, because you just said you do not have because you do not ask, but you ask and do not receive. Why? Because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasure. And there's that word pleasures again that we saw earlier on in this chapter. And so let's paraphrase that. Well, the reason you don't receive is because you're asking purely from a selfish motivation, which is indicative of the problem, the overall problem. You're fighting and quarreling because of your selfishness. Then, the same problem surfaces when you ask God for those things which you want that other people have. You just ask for your own selfish purposes, and so that you can have some pleasure or enjoyment, purely thinking of yourself. And so God says, man, I don't like your motive, and so I'm not going to grant it to you. You think about it. Which prayer is God more likely to answer? Lord, give me $1 million so I can get a yacht and a motorhome and a house on the ocean. Or, Lord, give me $1 million so I can take care of orphans and widows. That's a no-brainer. It's obvious. God is much more open to those unselfish prayers that are a reflection of His desires and not our desires, okay? And James is going to warn in this very next verse that really the whole problem is that you just love the wrong things. It's a reflection of your lack of love for God. Maybe I'll just mention it as we wind this down. Verse 4, you adulteresses, do you not know with friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Reminds me of a verse over in 1 John. John said, do not love the world nor the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Okay, so these are things we'll talk about next time in greater detail so we can examine our lives, make sure we're heading in the right direction. A lot of good stuff, hard-hitting stuff. Okay, can't wait to be with you next time. See you next time.
Visit us online at HeavenWord.tv to view this and every episode of HeavenWord TV for free. Watch the behind-the-scenes videos. Read other teaching articles, books, and devotionals written by David's servant, and learn about other exciting ministries that David directs. All this and more is at HeavenWord.tv.